we're joined by Bernard Hogan-Howe, who was Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police from 2011 to 2017 and now sits in the House of Lords. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you. It's good to be back.
So at the top of the show, I mentioned that only 1 in 5 Britons approve of the government's handling of crime, 66% disapprove. But during the last 5 years of the Tories, disapproval climbed even higher, and it only really fell during lockdown when everyone was indoors. In your experience, are people ever happy about crime policy?
Well, it can be. I mean, I think nobody expects cops to solve every crime. It's ridiculous, just not possible. They expect them to solve murders. They're less keen on, not as worried about other things which people might regard as more minor crime. So I think people, if they treat well, if the officer deals with them confidently, competently and caringly, then generally they're going to have a happy customer. I don't think people expect that they can do everything, but I think what they're not happy with is when, and you see this quite a lot, is they can't get through on the phone. Nobody comes. If somebody does go, they don't seem to be that bothered. And then nothing seems to happen. That's that's a litany of failure, really. So I think I've seen some very high percentage, because the cops survey. They'll survey confidence levels, which is generally, if you never met the police, how do you feel about them? And then satisfaction levels was, well, you have met them, but you're still satisfied. So we've surveyed those for probably 30 years. So you've got a good baseline at which, and there have been periods when the confidence level's been as high as 75%. And satisfaction 70 and 80%.
Yeah, it's interesting. There is a big difference because the stats that I read out there were for the government's handling of crime, and actually the satisfaction with the police is a lot better. So I don't know what that is. That sense that you kind of you quite like the police, but you don't trust the government.
To be fair to the government, I mean, I suppose what you're measuring there is, is the law right? If they got the law in the right position, even if the cops are doing a good job, the law might not be. I mean, the government. There's a big debate about immigration. There's a big debate about borders. That can infect the way people feel about the Home Office, for example, or the way the prisons are being run, which is not anything to do with the police. There's a connection, but it's not direct. So to be fair to the government, I can see why you might have a different view of each. But I think generally people are always aspiring to the future, aren't they? They want something better in the future. They tend to think of the cops a bit reactionary, a bit on the back foot. They protect what is there. They're not going to be the progressive liberals in the world. That's what you expect from the government, to think about the future and then put in place a good system for it. So I think it's a slightly different measure. I think there have been times where it's been good. There's certainly challenges at the moment, and there's different reasons for that, I think.
Well, we've seen this in America as well, that overall crime was falling. Not all offences, and we'll get onto that. But I mean, it's always a gap between basically the numbers of offences, the raw data, the objective facts, and how secure people feel, which can be subjective. You ask someone if they're worried about crime, that might not correlate with actually how much crime there is.
Yeah. Well, there's 2 big measures of how much crime there is. So number one is how much crime do the police record. But as we all know in this room, not everybody records all the crime that happens to them. Even very violent things, people won't always report. Might be they're in a relationship, they don't want to reveal that. There's lots of reasons why things don't get reported. Broadly, murders are, but even as we saw with Harold Shipman, there were 240 murders over a long period of time. So I think, recorded crime gives you an insight. And there are some crime types which I would say I'd rely on that to give an indication of up and down trends. Then you've got the British Crime Survey, which is pretty good. It's not perfect. That's just where people, answer a survey. Were you a victim of crime? How do you feel about it? All the rest of it. But it only surveys people at 17 and over. So it doesn't talk to that huge number of young people who are victims of crime disproportionately. Not the majority, but disproportionately. The one that I think gives a best absolute measure is probably the British Crime Survey. And they both together can give you some trend. But there are some crime types that it's just very hard to get people to report because of embarrassment. You look at sexual offences. It's still, the amount of reporting has gone up over the last few years, but it's still thought to be about 2/3 of it is not talked about. This is by women and by men. I suspect the numbers on men's side is potentially even higher.
I mean, because that's an example of a crime where you see the numbers going up. That might actually be a cultural change in that people are reporting things that they were not reporting. I mean, I have no idea, what reports of sexual assaults were like, in the 1950s, but that doesn't mean that there weren't that many.
No good looking at me.
I don't think you're that old, but you know what I mean.
I know what you mean. And, things do change over time. And what we know about sexual offences, quite often they're committed by people who know each other. So that makes it particularly difficult if it's a family, then how does that get revealed? And if it does get revealed, the damage to the family is immense. So you know that's a real problem. They get people in relationships or in partial relationships that start, stop, start again. It's a very difficult area, and I'm not going to defend the appalling rape convictions at the moment, but the only thing I would say, I think everybody accepts it's a difficult human area. It's the most intimate of things that somebody's going to have to talk about, and you have to talk to a police officer, and you might feel reassured that that's a private conversation, but you're probably going to have to talk about it in a court. And anybody feel happy? And of course, when you're doing that, it's not just what does the law say; it's what does that jury say. It's the law can be in advance of morality and whatever passes for morality, and the jury can have a completely different conception about what's okay and what's not okay. That's the final test. So I think the whole system is complex and is not easy to remedy. I think there are some things that could be done to remedy it, but to your point, I think there's a lot of underreporting of that type of crime. And then on the other side, there's always generally a report of insured goods that are stolen. People's cars, generally people are insured, so generally they tell the police because they don't get their insurance otherwise.
Sure.
There are links like that. Domestic burglary, i.e. somebody's home, it's relatively rare, but if it happens, it's horrible. That's a serious thing for most people, unless, of course, it was a burglary to steal somebody's drugs, in which case they don't report it at all, or the money associated with drugs. So, but on the whole, I would say things like burglary, things like car crime, very serious offences like stabbing, shooting, they get reported from a hospital because that's a serious thing that could have been a murder. So there are certain things in the system that make it more likely than not.
So given all the kind of, I suppose, the issues with these statistics, and the fact that crime is going down overall over the last few years, which offences are sort of bucking that trend? Which things are we seeing are actually going up?
The car crime, as in car theft. So about 20 years, cars were hard to steal. You had to have the key. So the thieves couldn't steal them easily. Now that they went to steal the key, then there were more assaults. But generally, the car crime came down drastically. But over the last probably 5 years, the criminals have found there's a way to do that. So they do it. And until they change the design of cars, one of the big crime prevention things, design things that have no value when they're stolen. They don't steal them to use them. They steal them to sell them. So therefore, if you reduce the value, you reduce the crime. So you see it with mobile phones, you see it with car crimes. But at the moment, it's going like that. Sorry, you can't see that on a podcast. It's going up. It's going up and up in a diagonal line.
Is that because they can use sort of radio frequencies and things on their phones?
Exactly. There are two ways. You interrupt the signal between the key and the car. By a scanner, and then another way is to clone the key. They're the broad ways. And I'm not telling the car thieves anything they don't know. Sadly, they can buy the key.
We do have a lot of car thieves listening.
I'm sure, yeah.
It's a big part of our demographic.
But you can go on the internet and do this. So, but to my first point, if we design the cars better, this will not happen in the same.
Everyone went around with those pouches. I've got one of those pouches, Faraday cage.
Well, that's a good
pouches.
idea. Yeah, you're right, quite right. Faraday cages, or putting them somewhere in the house that's well out of the way, and of course well away from the door. Because if somebody comes to your door, pushes past you, keys on the side. But we're all the same, aren't we? You get in for work, you get in for wherever, you've gone out for the night, you shove it down. So we can, you know why it happens. So that's certainly one crime. I mean, the other crime type that is increasing is fraud, mainly online. Most of it, vast majority is online now. And it's not just where somebody steals your identity or where steals your card details. I mean, there's a huge amount of people getting hurt by dating crime. Now, the average loss in some of these dating crimes is about £40,000 to £50,000. This is because what they're doing is targeting lonely people who want a relationship. They're vulnerable. Probably haven't got a family who's going to warn them. Hang on, let's have a look at this. So they're targeting online, and people, even when they know they've had their money stolen, still feel love of relationship for this online person they never met. So it's really manipulating people. But of course, they target them because they're vulnerable, and they target them because towards the end of their life, often they have assets that they can either liquidate, a house, or they've got cash. That's why they're doing it. So that's a really vulnerable group. But generally, online crime, fraud is high, and we're not able to intervene the way we'd hope. It's going more into crypto. So some of the assets are going into crypto assets rather than the old cash and other types of assets. And they're harder, but not impossible to track and deal with. And the cops are having to look for different ways of intervening in that. So there are two big types. I think broadly violence has been on the decline, broadly. But there's certain types. I mean, stabbings, you look here in London, there's been quite a lot of knife crime, generally. So there are things that still are around and struggle to decrease. But generally, there's 4 or 5 big ways to prevent crime, which is, as I said, design of place and things and control of alcohol sales. Alcohol is by far the biggest direct cause of crime in the evening.
You'll probably correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I'm right in thinking violent crime amongst children, on younger people, has gone up over the past few years.
Certainly reporting of it has.
Right.
You're right. It has. Whether it's gone up absolutely, as we were saying earlier, I'm not sure. Because, I mean, certainly I remember going to school and lots of people had fights all the time.
And
whether they reported it to the teachers or whether teachers felt a safeguarding need to go on and report it further, because otherwise they're condemned if they don't report it. So I'm not sure whether it's more of it or more reporting of it.
I mean, a lot of people that experience, if they're sort of fortunate, I suppose, they're mostly going to experience low-level crimes like, mobile phone theft, and if you've got a shop, shoplifting. And there's this sort of suggestion that I suppose a lot of these crimes are effectively decriminalised because there just aren't the resources to tackle them. And you don't expect like the squad to be chasing down the man on the bike who's just nicked your phone. I mean, but that's a dispiriting thing to hear if you're a victim, particularly if you say run a shop and you just go, actually, do you know what? There's a certain degree of shoplifting that is just not going to be dealt with. I mean, is that true? And is there a solution to that beyond vastly more resources?
Sadly, I think it is true. And I don't believe the resourcing argument, I'm afraid.
Oh, okay.
So, I mean, I think, shoplifting is a relative, if it's a packet of cheese, it's a relatively minor crime. It can be very serious because, in the sense that if it's organised, somebody's stealing iPods and iPads and all sorts of things, then it's often organised for resale. So you get that sort of crime. That's relatively minor, the minority. Then you get people who do steal for food. They're hungry. I think it's relatively few, but it does happen. You get people who steal because of addiction. They're drunk. They're alcoholics. They go in. We see it sadly quite a lot.
That's so many times people running in, grabbing beers and running out, and then sometimes they get away, sometimes they don't.
Yeah, I don't justify it, but it's clearly what's happening. It's an alcoholic stealing not to make profit, but to fulfil their need. And probably 90% of most shoplifters have got a drug habit, and they're feeding the drug habit. They're not literally. They're getting the money to. So it's a complex trial. I think what's happened over the years, and I think it probably started around COVID, is first of all with COVID, as you mentioned at the beginning, cops stopped attending some crimes because people were at home and there was that fear of getting COVID. About the same time, we lost about 20,000 police in the country. So if you remember, post the 2008 banking crisis, all public service took a haircut, and the police took 20,000. My feeling is the combined effect of that left a lot of police leaders thinking we can't do everything. I don't agree with that. I think you should do as much as you can with what you've got. But if the bosses start to be defeatist, the danger is the people on the ground feel that pressure. So I think there's something internal about the police they've got to look at. And even though there is a lot of crime, if you look here in London, it's about 1 million crimes a year, which sounds a horrendous amount. There are 32 boroughs in London. There are 365 days a year. On average, it's 3 crimes per borough per hour. It's not 10,000. And with the number of cops around, you ought to be able to organise yourself to at least do something in each of those cases, I would say.
Right. So even if you can't, realistically arrest every mobile phone theft, every sort of minor burglar, every shoplifter, what you don't want to do is to give the impression that you've almost made an operational decision that you're just not going to try.
Yeah, I agree. And just one other thing, because I think, although I'm having a go away at the police, I'll support them where I can, but if I don't agree with something, I would say so. I think the other thing that's contributed to some of the lack of action has been the Crown Prosecution Service has broadly stopped prosecuting low-level shoplifting. So it might be a caution or whatever. And the cops know that. Now, even the shoplifter, you're probably going to take 5 hours in the police station with it. If it's a young person, it could be even longer. You've got to get them in, you've got to book them in, you've got to get a solicitor, they've got to have time. I won't bore you with the process, but it's not short. Then you've got to produce a file. And it's happened, I would say, with the possession of cannabis as well, is that over time, they say, well, this is wasting my time, it's wasting society's time. By the way, there's more serious things we're missing. So they start to self-regulate, but the people who made those decisions are the Crown Prosecution Service. That was
and they don't have to sort of justify it to the electorate, in a sense,
and exactly. I'm not. It sounds like I'm having to go to Crown Prosecution. I'm really not. That was their decision, for which they broadly aren't held to account. They don't go to public meetings in Islington. That's not their part of their world. The cops do, so they get it in the neck. Partly for some of their own decisions, which I would agree, and partly for, say, the prosecution policy. So that's been quite a challenge over the last few years.
I want to be clear, I have no horse in this race, but with cannabis possession, I mean, isn't that a fairly just sort of wise decision? I know it's not legal, I know it's not decriminalised, but I mean, it does seem like, would that be a good use of resources if you're talking about?
I can see that argument, and I'm not against it. I'm not. The trouble is, it's where do you draw the line, really? Is it the supplier of 5 grams, drops a couple of mates and just hands it round? It's a real difficulty because I'm not sure it is a gateway drug. But one of the things I found, one of the things I do in the Lords is that there's something called Learn with the Lords. And so members of the House of Lords go around different schools, secondary schools, and you explain what they do. But because of what they know I did, we always end up talking about policing, and particularly about cannabis and drugs. One of the things I asked them, I said, did they know that if you take cannabis before the age of 16, you're 6 times more likely to become psychotic because your brain is, until you're 24, is not formed in the way. Now, they're not told that. Because we've got this, it kills you. Well, it doesn't kill you, clearly, because lots of people their parents quite often are taking it and have survived. But I think if you can give people facts from which they will make decisions, they're not idiots. They don't want to harm themselves. And even if, 6 times more likely to become psychotic sounds a horrendous number. Actually, the chance of becoming psychotic are very low. So if that's 1 in a million, it's 6. It's still a very low number. But I'd want to know. And if you've got children, you might want to be aware of that. So I think there might be a wisdom in giving more education. I understand what you're saying. But the danger is as well, I think what we see in London, but you see it in all our big cities. You walk down Victoria Street and every 50 feet, I can smell it. So you get to a point where then cops must be doing the same thing. And then somebody said, well, why aren't you doing something? You end up in this horrible tension and say, well, so you enforce some crimes but not others. On what grounds are you not enforcing that? So I think that's where politicians have got to have courage.
I was going to say, to coin a phrase, it's the 2-tier system then, isn't it? Because you've got some crimes that are enforced and some aren't. And I think then it's very easy for, people on the right to kind of go, well, this is because of da-da-da-da. And I think
not 2-tier in the sense that they mean.
No, exactly. But it's in a real sense that there are some crimes
it's always been there. As I said, because the police, I would say broadly, I don't mean reactionary as a body, but the reaction as a structure, they protect the past.
Yeah.
And the laws were created years ago. So and then when it gets to this point where laws are probably, or attitudes are changing, society is changing, if the longer they hold on to the past, the more they get criticised. And then someone said, well, why do you still enforce this law? Well, because that happens to be the law. Yeah. And if you don't, you get into problems. And if you do, why just him? Why not her? And so I think it's a complex thing, but I think
it's a political question, isn't it, really?
Well, that's why politicians are there. Everybody wants to criticise them, but they're there to take the tough decisions that we probably can't quite get our head around. Because, let's say, if you do legalise, which is where we're going with this conversation, but even if you legalise, you're not going to give it to 4-year-olds. So you're still going to have a legal market.
Maybe.
Minimum. Oh, please God, yeah. And you look,
I know what you mean.
You look in America, and I did something over there a couple of years ago in Colorado. They've now got edibles that have got TBC ratings of about 95%, which is huge. Now, of course, many people self-regulate. It's legal to have it, so they don't consume a lot of it. Apparently, a lot of them overdose at the beginning because it goes into digestion, so it takes about 4 hours to get through. They're used to a smoke, immediate effect. So they've had it on the 4th chocolate bar. By the time they realise they've overdosed. But that's something that they learn eventually. So, if the law's held in disregard, then the cops get it in the neck, whichever way they go with it.
Well, just to pan out a bit from the police then, you mentioned the CPS, and one of the stories of underfunding in recent years has been the court system and people waiting a very long time for trial. So is that another, that's maybe something that people are not seeing on the front line, but it's sort of, there are not the resources at that end to kind of take somebody all the way through to conviction.
Yeah, all right, I've said I can't agree with the policy for CPS, but to be fair to them, I don't think they are funded well enough. And I think the other thing we've got in this country is there's some very good lawyers there. But on the whole, if you look at America, then people tend to spend a short time, or at least some time, in the criminal prosecution system or the criminal defence system, which is not that well paid, frankly, in America or anywhere in the world. So they sort of get their experience there, but make the money in private sector. We've never had that tradition. So people go into the public service, but don't tend to come out of it. Not always. They certainly don't tend to go the other way. Very rare for you to see somebody who's making money in law to go into CPS unless they become DPP or whatever. But at the routine working level, they don't do it. So I think they've got real problems in getting the right volume and the right quality. So I understand that. And it's clearly a massive post-COVID backlog. And equally, I think the criminal justice system could do with a bit of a kick up the backside. If you look at, I think they sit on 240 days a year. Well, there are 365 days, so they could sit 10% longer. They could sit at weekends. They might even sit in the evening when witnesses find it convenient. So I think the whole, and of course it's regulated at the top end. There'll be judges listening to this now and complaining like mad, but the Crown Court system sits at the top of it, and if they're not sitting as often as they might, there's some very arcane ways that they do business. We saw, certainly when I took over in 2011, we just had the London riots. We saw the court start to sit within 24 hours, through the night, or certainly into the evening. It can crank itself up.
Again, with last summer's riots.
Yeah, of course.
It's very efficient.
There's a blockage at the end now. I would say you've got too many people in prison. And, because it's just clogging the system. So now we get into this stage of, well, do you prosecute? If you do prosecute, do you give a shorter sentence? And so to your first question, I think the whole system needs some investment, but it also it's no good in putting, I would say, you see this with the NHS and the police, it's no good putting money in if you haven't rethought how you're going to do something.
Well, so you've basically explained how complicated it is. There's the police thing, there is courts, there are the prisons, everything knocks on something else. So just to look at what the Labour government is doing, Starmer obviously used to run the CPS and he's very proud of various sort of decisions that he made then. What do you make of the Labour government's position on crime at the moment in terms of both policy and messaging? Are they striking the right chord?
I think it's all right at the moment. To be fair, they've put in more cops and more police community support. I was thinking about 12,000, something like that. Or they're being recruited. They put the money in there. So I think that's good. They're expecting some efficiencies. I think about 5%, which basically means a budget cut 5%. It's masked as an efficiency, but you've basically got a smaller budget. You've got to create the efficiency to make it work. But I don't think that's unreasonable. I think any organisation, no matter who you are, can make savings. So I think that's okay. They're trying to get to grips with the prison service. You've got a really good prison minister, Lord Timpson, who, his father created Timpson Shoes. And, he's always employed people who've had a criminal background. And I think he's got some good ideas, business-like, not trying to create profit. But from what I've seen, I think he's, going to be a force for good. And I think he'd probably, there's a lot of things that can be done creatively around prisons. Getting more people out, putting them on tags. There's something I started with Kit Malthouse in the Met. There's something called sobriety tagging. So remember I was saying earlier that alcohol can cause people to commit crime. And I'll not bore you with where it started. It started in America, but they did it a slightly different way. But generally speaking, what it means is that where you get an offence where alcohol is a contributory or major factor, you say, okay, then you're going to go in for your sentence. When you come out, you can have some time off if you wear a tag. And the tag will tell us if you're drinking. Because if you do drink, you'll probably be domestic violence, it'll be theft, it'll be sexual offences. So you start to allow them a freedom, not complete freedom, but you start to bear down on what's causing, in their case, not chronically for everybody. You can do it around drugs, you can do it around mental health. Mental health is a little bit different, but you can now give people chips. Because what happens with people who have got mental health issues, which cause them, if not cause them, but or a context in which they commit their offences, then they often stop taking the medication. And because they're usually on their own, they have no family to support them, nobody's there to say, actually, you haven't taken it, or you're taking it as a side effect. The people who support them in the community aren't with them all the time. So the first time often that they declare they haven't been taking the medication, where the cops get called because they've hit someone, or they've stolen something, or the behaviour's become unusual. The cops are the least well equipped to deal with somebody in a mental health episode. But if you gave them a chip which said, tell the local nurse, actually not taking the medication, you may want to check on them, see what they're doing. There may it could be a suicidal thing, could be all sorts of things, rather than waiting for the flat next door to say, I'm really worried about what's happening. So I think there are things that they're starting to look at which would be creative and I would say progressive. I think I would say I'd restructure the police. I'd have far less police forces. I'd invest in the IT far more. You've got 43 forces with 43 budgets, spending 1.6 billion on IT, which seems to me balmy, much of which only creates lists, but don't actually stop all crime or help victims, really. Anyway, they're disputing. But I think this government's prepared to be progressive. There's going to be pressure around public spending. We can see that.
Well, earlier in the show, we were talking about something a bit less progressive, which is the politics of immigration, and the anti-migrant parties are always trying to sort of link immigration to crime. But the surveys that, the studies that there have been show that it's that there doesn't appear to be a clear correlation. Sometimes they show that it goes up slightly, sometimes down slightly, sometimes no difference at all. Like, what was your experience as commissioner? Did the Met collect data on, whether it was for a foreign national or whatever? I mean, did you have an impression that there was any connection?
Well, there was certainly, we collected data about what was called foreign national offences because there was a legal requirement to do so.
Okay.
Because often, for example, if somebody was a foreign national on arrest, they have a right to have their embassy informed, as you would if you're abroad. Because in some countries, you'd want them to be you might never get out. But anyway, so there's legal requirements to record it. And I think it was about 28, 29% were foreign national offenders of the people we arrested every year. So not far off a third, but that was London. It wasn't a different London that we all see and hear every day. So it wasn't that foreigners were causing more crime. It was just proportionate to society broadly. They were committing crime. Now, there are some groups who commit some types of crime more. I mean, the Albanian country of Albania controls about 80% of the cocaine supply to Europe, which is not bad for 3 million people. Is it really? I mean, I can't celebrate it, but I just observe.
An ambivalent hats off to the Albanian gangs.
How do you respond to that?
We could go around other countries. There were other countries who did ATM fraud pretty well.
Right.
There's some people in the northwest who supply heroin pretty well. So it's not that certain groups are more criminal. It is that sometimes they've got better links, better networks.
Right.
The cocaine came in from South America. Apparently there was a link to Hamas. These are the complex things that sometimes underpin some of the crime types. So you had to understand that if you're going to intervene in it as well. And I think, so therefore different parts of the country have different issues with it. And it causes issues for the police and the criminal justice system because you need more translators. Not everybody. To be fair, most people speak English better than I do, but if you're going to go into the criminal justice system, then you're going to have a good translation of what they're accusing you of to be able to represent yourself. So that causes its own pressures. And you end up with where you started the conversation, right, which is people can blame all foreigners for crime, which is not right.
Well, finally, I wanted to talk about obviously what happened last summer with the riots after Southport, and there were various allegations being made of two-tier policing in that, the sort of the more sort of far right sense, and the claim that facts were being kept from us, or there was anger at the police for not defining the attacks as terrorism, or for not revealing facts, even though of course a lot of those would have involved jeopardising the trial and so on and so forth. Obviously, you're not sort of frontline policing at the moment, but I mean, how do the police deal with a kind of a part of the political spectrum that is both calling for kind of stronger policing, but is also making things a lot more difficult? Like, how does the police respond to allegations like that?
Most of the time, it's fairly obvious it's been a terrorist attack. You've seen a bomb.
Yeah.
Multiple people have died. That's not usual criminal behaviour in any way. So the first inclination is this could be a terrorist thing. The second indication is that the counter-terrorist police are investigating it. They are within the police but separate. So if that happens, of course, in this case, I think what had happened was that obviously the awful attack and murdering of children, and that was the initial shock. Then there was the online inaccurate information about the origins of that person and whether it had been right or wrong. It wasn't relevant to what had happened with this case. It looks as though there was ricin discovered, which we would say now is an indicator of terrorism, but not conclusive. And there was a terrorist manual. But of course, I guess, I don't know what day they found it. It might have been the week 2. It might have been a garage he controlled, not where he lived. I don't know where it was found. It might have been an online discovery rather than an actual discovery. So I can see that would be staggered. And the problem you've got then is that if you start to announce that after you've arrested, query before or after charge, the risk of compromising the trial is quite high. I mean, if somebody says, we've had to clear 200 people out or 2,000 people out of this area because there's a bomb, it's fairly obvious, isn't it? Or there's ricin, or there's a chemical, and you're going to have to describe that chemical because you're telling people to leave their home. So if that sort of thing happens, often it becomes public for public safety grounds. But all the time, and this is why sometimes I was talking to a colleague about today, you see cops using really odd language. I mean, as journalists, you think, why do you talk about persons? Why do you talk about dwellings? Why did you say man or woman? Often I think what's happening is they're processing. They're trying to process. You've just asked me a question. I don't want to compromise the prosecution.
Yeah.
So how to put it in neutral language that gives you as much as I can, but doesn't compromise that.
Yeah.
So it's a constant battle that they're having with themselves to not compromise the prosecution, not reveal information. So I think there's some of that probably going off as well. And it's clear, I mean, if you've got people getting badly hurt in riots as we had, you've got to think about that. You can't just say, well, you've got to tell everybody. Somebody's got to think that through, because afterwards, if they do reveal it and more people get hurt, then somebody will say, well, why don't you just keep it quiet for 24 hours? So I think I can see why it's been a dilemma, but it does seem to have been quite an unusual case in the staggering of the information they got. And by the time they were getting the information that was showing it could be terrorism, of course, never a charge of terrorism, then it would have been wrong to reveal it. So I think they've had a dilemma. And one of these things, whichever way you go, you could be criticised. So do what you think's right.
Oh, thank you so much, Bernard Hogan-Howe.
Thank you.